and thank you for joining today's session, the second session of the third season for Azure Fest. This season will contain 6 episodes broadcasted live on a weekly basis until the end of October. So if you haven't, please register for the subsequent episodes. All right. Before we move on with today's topic, a reminder on the rules. Right, this episode is recorded and will be available on demand in 2 to 3 weeks. Most importantly, I encourage you to use a Q&A section to ask any questions you might have during and after the presentation, right? So that our speakers can respond to you in live. At the end, we'll have 10 minutes to go through any question that might not have been answered during the presentation. Today's session will be presented by Murthy and Sharmila, two of our CSS from Singapore team, as well as Vincent and Rias to answer your questions. Cloud Solution Architects are here to support our customers in public sectors as well in private companies. But today we'll focus on one specific topic, which is defense in depth and how to prevent attacks to advancing critical systems. So it's my pleasure to introduce Murthy and the team.
Hi everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening from wherever you are joining from. My name is Murthy, and I'm a cloud solution architect, and I bring in 15 plus years of experience in this industry and this IT sector. And today, what we're going to talk about is actually today's our agenda is we have very straight line agenda. So we have just minimum 3 headlines. So one is about the CCOP 2.0, and the second item is actually the defense in depth overview. Of course, we are going to talk about what are the different layers of defense which we can adapt, which the Azure offers, and the third section is actually the security operations, right? So good. Let's directly dive into our topic. The first slide, what you see here, right? It's actually a cybersecurity code of practice. Okay, I think by looking at the slide, you see a lot of acronyms. It's called CCOP and the CIO and the CII and the CSP. There are a lot more acronyms you see there, and let's make everything is very simple. So the CCOP means it's actually a cyber security code of practice, right? In Singapore, we have dedicated agencies who controls all this cyber security features, who regularly publishes and ensures that the people are protected, and also releases the regular the compliances and what are the security features which we supposed to adapt on all the organizations and etc. So the agency is actually the Cyber Security Agency of Singapore, have recently launched a Cyber Security Code of Practice 2.0 in July this year, 2022, right? So what does the CCOP means? So it's nothing but, because we all as an organizations and, we all have our own infrastructure running in-house or running might be in a cloud platform, right? So what happens, some of my workloads are highly critical, and very, which I need to make sure that they are well protected. So these workload and these kind of infrastructure, we call them as a critical information infrastructure. So that's what that CIO means, right? So there is also the other acronyms called the CIO. What I mean is, and as a owner of this kind of an infrastructure, and what action I should be taking, in order to protect my data and the information. So what are the minimum requirement I should meet, right? So that's what the cyber security code of practice comes in. And it's nothing but it just brings in minimum security requirements where the organizations or the agencies can adapt to ensure that your data are well protected, right? It's just a security best practices. So we'll move on to the next slide, okay? And here we talk about defense in depth, okay? As you guys, if you guys gone through the CCOP document that was published by the Cybersecurity Agency Singapore, and you will see that the defense in depth is one of the verticals they discussed, right? Of course, there are many verticals, and the defense in depth is one of them, right? So let's not waste any time, and let's directly jump into the our topics today. Okay. So here, right, when it comes to defense in depth, then the name might look like, it's a defense in depth. So which means, are we going to cover so deep inside the, security features or the security poster of it, and there might be a lot of technical, words or technical phrases. No, okay, because this session is mainly for, we're going to cover only for around 40 or 45 minutes. So, and every sections would require, a dedicated, working kind of a session or in-house sessions, to go deep dive into it. So in this session, we are going to cover the entire Azure landscape and what are the security posters we have and what are the different security controls we have. So the slide what you are looking at here, okay, this slide might be familiar to some of you guys already. And since Microsoft is a cloud service provider, so it's very important for all of us to understand the shared responsibility model for security services as well, right? Because we have a shared responsibility model for hosting your applications in cloud. And what you are seeing right now is it's the same slide, but it's more towards the security shared responsibilities, right? Okay. Fine. So now we see, and it's important, as I mentioned, it's very important for us to understand, what are the security tasks that are handled by Microsoft as a customer, what I should be paying attention to. For example, any data that we host in cloud and the customer owns the responsibility. Customers are responsible of protecting them. Okay, as a cloud provider, of course, we provide we are Microsoft is responsible for for any physical data center security, but any data that belongs to customer, yes, customer has to ensure. Of course, Microsoft as a platform provider, yes, we do offer different set of tools and services that customers can leverage onto it, right? Okay, fine. Let's just move on to the next one. Okay, so this is actually the defense in depth, right? Defense in depth, it's not a service or it's not a any sort of a tooling or any sort of process. It's actually a strategy. Okay, this strategy can vary from company to company or organization to organization, right? Because the strategy is some certain set of process, certain set of layers formed up. So when you look at here, right, of course, when it comes to Azure, and we have multiple layers of protection, and that will help to slow down or prevent any attacks that are aimed to acquire our unauthorized access to our data. Right. In this session, we will just go through the key concept of defense in depth. Okay, and also identify what are the different security technologies and approaches to support this strategy. Let's start with the data, right? Of course, the data is always in center of our our layers, right? Of course, the data is the one what we are trying to protect. And the data means it can be anything. It can be a user or data rows and columns. It can come from your databases, or it could be your files or any information that belongs to a customer or any sort of business, right? So that's our core service that we are trying to protect. In any cloud offerings, whether it's in IaaS or PaaS or SaaS, of course, as I mentioned earlier, the customer is responsible to protect the sensitive data, and this layer controls the access to the data that you need to protect. Right. Then the very next layer is actually the application. Of course, we all know, right? Application is actually front end for our data services, right? And that is the place where we are going to provide data to our consumers or the customers, and at the same time, consumers are going to share the data with us, right? So protecting a network layer is a one aspect of it, and protecting an application is completely in a different, vertical, when it comes to it, because once the moment when your application is not protected well, it doesn't matter how well you protect your infrastructure. Your application is if your application is vulnerable, then it's going to be quite straightforward and quite easy for the attackers to get in and steal your data. So protecting application is actually as important as protecting your network as well, right? The next layer is actually compute. Okay, the main focus of this layer is to make sure your compute resources are secure, and compute resource pretty much it's just a virtual machines, and just make sure you have a patching on up to date, and just make sure you have endpoint protections, and access to these compute resources has to be restricted. Yes, these are all the things comes into as part of this layering. The next layer is actually the networking. At this layer, actually, we mainly focus on limiting the network connectivity between your resource to resource. Of course, when we talk about any sort of an applications or in a project, of course, we have multiple, our resources, right? For example, application layers and front-end layers or the database layers, or you might be having an integration with your other systems, and how do we control access between these resources? And how do we make sure that, how do we make sure, the access is only granted, based on what is really needed, right? So yes, all these kind of access controls will be controlled at this layer. On top of that, yes, we have a perimeter layer. Perimeter layer is mainly, this layer mainly uses the DDoS services to protect and filter the large scale attacks before they even reach out to your networks. Then the most critical layer, which is identity and access. So, and identity and access layer is all about, ensuring identities are secured, access granted is only what is needed, right? So, and to me, I would consider identity and access is one of the sensitive layer which we have to be more cautious about, because how well you protect your environment, be it a security, network, perimeter, or be it application or data, if your identities are get compromised, then it's going to be a straightforward, because once your identity get compromised, then attackers can make use of this identity and log into your system as a legitimate user, right? And none of your network components is going to protect, or none of your network components is going to prevent this access. So identity is more critical, and we have to pay attention to it, right? So in the subsequent session, what we are going to see is we do have a dedicated slide and dedicated section to cover each layers. So let's go into the next slide. Okay, so this actually the difference in depth and the layers what we talked in the earlier slide. So these are the different set of tools what Azure offers, which you can as a customer, which you guys can leverage to it. And yes, we do have a dedicated slide for each vertical. So let's directly go into the dedicated sections. Yeah, the first section is actually the data, right? So when it comes to a data, and the data can be classified mainly in three categories, right? Where mainly it's two categories, to be honest. One is actually a structured data, another is unstructured data, right? So the structured data is those which has a relations to each other, and especially those specifically those data is going to reside from into your databases. Unstructured data is anything that resides in your storage account or in your virtual machines or in your application servers. Those things are called unstructured data. So the main classification is actually virtual machines and the applications and the storage and the databases. How do we protect our compute resources? And we do have a dedicated section to it, and one of our colleagues, Shamila, is going to cover those topics down the link and later part of this session. So for this section, we just mainly focus on how do we protect our applications and our data services, right? Okay, so we'll move on to the next slide. Let's first focus on the data. Okay, when you look at the data protection, right, and in this case, we are talking about the structured data, and for this example, we took a SQL DB as an example. So, of course, the SQL database provides a range of inbuilt security and the compliance features to help the help us to meet various security and the compliance requirements. And it's all illustrated here. Again, it's going to be a layer-based approach. And for example, first it at the network layer, and you have to ensure that you have enabled all your transport level securities are in place, and all your data are being encrypted, and also your data masking, data directory are classified properly, and etc. Right. See, the auditing and compliance, this also offers auditing and compliance, and any transactions or any sort of traffic in and out to your SQL database is being well audited, and of course we can just monitor and we can just trigger events on any miscellaneous activities on that. So data encryption at rest is another topic which we have to pay attention to it, and as a platform provider, any data what you store in Azure storage account, or be it in a PaaS or SaaS or any sort of or be it in IaaS infrastructure, all your data are encrypted at rest. Right. Of course, we as a customer, yes, you should have an option to use how do you want to control this encryption and what sort of keys you wanted to use. Yes, that's up to us to go ahead deep and discuss on that. But we have to ensure that yes, all our data are encrypted at rest as well as encryption in motion. Right. And another key thing, because since we're talking about the SQL database protection here, the data encryption in motion is something which only Azure SQL database offers at this moment. right? And this feature ensures your data are protected, and in flight as well as in rest, as well as even during your query processing. Okay, so which we normally call it as if you guys are familiar with the database properly, we call this as always encrypted. So yeah, by adopting this approach, by adopting these features, and you can ensure that yes, your data is protected and your data is encrypted at any stage of your processing or any stage of your data movements. And plus, it's a good to take care of your role level securities, and also having an integration with Azure Active Directory is a best practices, and of course because SQL authentication is prone to vulnerabilities, right? So because it's a username and password. So yes, these are some of the best practices which we should be adapting to it. And also the SQL database that comes with the inbuilt firewalls, where you can just go ahead and enable that. Then you can just whitelist, who wanted to really have access to it, and also you can apply all your network features and network security, and control, and who wants to, in and flow of your data. Yeah. The next section, actually, this section, what you are seeing is actually a data protection. This one is actually mainly talks about the storage protection. So when it comes to Azure storage account, everything resides into a storage account, right? Whatever you push, and be it your IaaS infrastructure, or be it your your data files, or be it your Azure file shares, or everything resides into underlying storage. Underlying is going to be a storage account. Of course, we have different categories of storage accounts, different categories of SKUs. That's a different topics altogether here. But how do we ensure that yes, the data, the information what I store in my storage accounts are well protected, right? So yes, these are the best practices what we used to follow. Yes, the storage account by default, it comes with a set of features, set of controls, and by adapting in combination with your security centers, yes, by going with Azure Defender for the storage account, that will gives you the all sort of advanced threat protection capabilities. Of course, the storage account comes with its firewall capabilities, and we will strongly encourage customers to go and enable the firewalls for your every storage accounts. So that will make sure that and your only the whitelisted IP addresses is going to have an access to your storage. Right, and also we have a shared access keys, and also we have other private endpoints. Private endpoint is another topic which we will strongly recommend to go and adapt, because this will ensure that, because when you talk about storage account, by default it comes with the multiple endpoints, right? And one is by default is going to be public endpoints. Of course, no customer wants to expose their data over the internet, right, over the public endpoint. So that is where we have a private endpoint and the service endpoint, where you can just restrict the access to your storage account only to from your private networks, right? Or whether you wanted to restrict with your private IPs, or whether you wanted to go with a service endpoint which will still access over the internet, but however the source side is going to be restricted from your private networks, right? And pretty much you can control everything. And this is another very good security features that comes by default is actually no read without any write. So which means by default, even if some anonymous users gain access to your SAS keys, or maybe gain access to your storage account, so what's going to happen is by default the inbuilt advanced threat protection is not going to allow any users to read any data unless if they write anything into a storage account. So that will ensure that even if the SAS keys, or even if the accesses land into a different tenant, and who try to breach your storage account and try to access the information, and they will not be able to access. Okay, so and the next one is actually the data protection, and this is actually the Azure firewall capability what we talk about. So Azure Storage Firewall provides an additional layer of security to your storage accounts beyond the authentication and authorization. Of course, authentication authorization is always the first layer of security. First, you should have a valid authentication and valid username and passwords, and also you should have a valid token to access your storage account. Then the next layer is actually comes at the network layer. That's where the Azure firewall comes into the play. So whatever you whitelist, and only those whitelisted IPs and whitelist network segmentations would could establish an access to your storage account, right? And so this one, and then on top of that, of course, you have to handle your storage accounts and access layers, and and role-based access, and these are all provides your user level access. And the next one is actually the data protection. This is actually it's advanced threat protection, and as I mentioned, by onboarding your storage accounts into a security center. So by default, it gives you more set of advanced threat protections, and also it gives you all sort of an alerts from the anomalous access, and also it gives you all sort of telemetry information where we can just keep on monitoring, and we can just trigger, and and we can do automations on based on the anonymous anomalies what we have identified, what we have tracked based on the security centers. So that pretty much covers the data protection for your storage accounts as well as your SQL Server. So the next section is actually about the application protection. So the application layer, as I mentioned, is the next layer, and it's actually HTTP traffic. So web applications are actually prone to, they are the easy target for users because web applications directly bypasses, comes through all the way through your network and it's just directly exposed to the internet, right? And that is so easy, target for all the attackers out there, right? And because and moreover the web applications are, and it has to be it's prone to vulnerabilities. For example, the common vulnerabilities will normally we call it as SQL injections, or maybe be it a cross-site scripting, or be it your a session hijacking, and for example, somebody opens a session and just leaves a a laptop, and for example, if you open multiple tabs, and what happens if the subsequent the second tab or third tabs are trying to hijack session what is running in the first tabs, and all these attacks are so it's very vulnerable. So in that case, we have to pay more attention on this, on securing your applications. Again, how do we secure your applications? There are multiple ways of doing this. And the first layer is actually from your network standpoint, and yes, we can protect at, at your network standpoint. And the second layer is actually from your application side, right? Preventing, such this kind of, the SQL injections, or or cross-site scripting, or maybe directory browsing, this kind of attacks, it can be handled, as I mentioned, it can be handled in two ways. One is at the network level, second is the code level. But handling these kind of attacks at the code level is going to be quite challenging, okay? Because the reason is, it may require your developers, to start thinking, your design or security as a design platform, when they start building their code, right? Once if you already have a inbuilt applications, if you already have a pre-built application, then incorporating all this, this kind of application vulnerability security features into a code is going to be quite challenging, or it's going to be more time consuming, right? So if that's the case, and also what happens if you have more than one application? If you have 4 applications or 5 applications, then it's going to be quite challenging, because you must be replicating all these kind of security features from application to applications. So for that reasons, yes, that is where the web application firewall comes into the play. So what we are doing is all these kind of anomalies, what this kind of vulnerabilities can be handled outside of your applications. So that's where the web application firewall comes in, and this is a specially designed firewalls which mainly look after your HTTPS traffics or HTTP based traffics. So typically we have two kind of firewalls, right? Typical network firewall, which takes care of your all TCP layer transport level firewalls. And WAF is actually a layer 7 firewall, which takes care of your HTTP based traffic, right? So this actually pretty much it can offload some of these application level security features. So some of the common features, as we see, right, is application protection. So the DDoS attacks, of course, it can come from the perimeter layer, and applications attacks are, we have discussed, this kind of cross vulnerabilities and all this kind of attacks. And the miscellaneous bots, it's quite common nowadays. They target your infrastructure as well as your web application to gain, to gain access to your data and information. So all these informations can be protected with your WAF. So this is actually how the WAF architecture is going to look like. And the WAF is actually, it's a platform as a service offered by Azure, and it's a fully managed, service, where the customer can just go ahead and and subscribe to it. And WAF comes in two different WAF comes as an inbuilt into two different services. So either if you have a resource hosted in your in-house, and and if you have regional-based resources, then you can just pretty much you can go and adapt and activate or enable this WAF and your application gateway. So application gateway is actually your layer 7 load balancer, and that has a WAF capability built to it. But if you have an application or global applications which are delivered, which are accessed from different regions, and that has to be load balanced at a regional level. And if you have a global endpoint for it, then that's the case where typically we would advise go and adapt Azure Front Door, because that's going to be your that's going to be control your HTTP or layer 7 traffic at the global network level, global endpoints. Yeah, the next one is actually the application protection, and this one To configure your if you want to ensure and whether your application whether is it protected or end to end and if that's the case pretty much you have to go ahead with your SSL offloading, because see, we are going to place your application gateway or front door or maybe the WAF component in front of the users as well as in the in your actual application servers. If that is the case, and yes, we all know that I think no website out there, which exists without HTTPS. So all of our sites are already protected, and all our TCL or TLS encrypted. So if that is the case, your traffic from your end users to your application service is going to be encrypted. So if this traffic is passing through your WAF, so WAF have no information. So WAF cannot decrypt these informations without decrypting this tunnel, and they cannot inspect, what kind of a traffic is flowing through it. So for that reason, what we have to do is, yes, if you want to ensure your end-to-end, TLS, for your application, then we should be configuring this SSL into your WAF or in your application gateway as well, so that your WAF component knows that yes, how to decrypt the traffic and how to inspect the traffic. Then it just makes sure that the communication and whatever is passed through and everything is being scanned, everything is being, all this, vulnerability is being addressed and then passed through it. So it's a highly recommend, you just configure, SSL offloading and or maybe the SSL, decryption and re-encrypt at the WAF level. So that's pretty much the application level. The next one is actually the perimeter level leyer of security. So this one pretty much comes as DDoS protection. So Azure DDoS, it comes in two different flavors. So Azure DDoS, by default, all entire your Azure infrastructure and all your networks are protected with the DDoS. So Azure includes basic, distributed denial of services protection, which can which can protect your any infrastructures in what we offer, be it your Office 365 or be it your Windows updates or even the other services like Xbox Live and Azure, right? But on top of that, we do have a different another flavor called Azure DDoS, standard, so which gives you capabilities like a real-time monitoring and alerting via your Azure monitor. So and also your Azure DDoS standard, it comes with a flavor like and where you can go and target and do analytics at your resource level, right? If you do not have a standard protection, then still you are covered with a DDoS attack, but unfortunately you may not be having access to the reports, you may not be having access to the historical data of attacks in case if you wanted to document that stuff for your audit and the compliance. Right. So for that reasons, yes, standard gives you all this kind of a capability. But in either case, yes, your infrastructure, whatever you are hosting and what the data, whatever you are hosting, the application, whatever you are hosting in Azure, it's all well protected with your data. Okay, so yeah, so that's one thing. And the next slide, actually, it's DDoS mitigation. So what it happens is, see, pretty much the attacks are going to be, it's more and more, it's getting cheaper. So attack-based softwares, and are getting cheaper, and even you would get, this kind of DDoS attacks and all set of anonymous attacks, are generating softwares, just in the matter of few dollars and what. So it's getting so cheap. So that's why DDoS is pretty much important. Okay, so anyway, it's well protected, and if you want to if you want to meet your organizational compliance requirements, then that's where you just want subscribe to a DDoS standard, right? And that comes with the inbuilt features. Where you can just configure your mitigations. We do have a preset of and a 60 plus mitigations where you can go and and enable, and you can just automate that stuff, right? And yes, and also as I mentioned here, and how do you do that and elaborate? And this protection can be configured at your network level. Individual virtual networks you can go ahead and enable, whether you wanted to really track and you wanted to generate the reports out of this, this kind of attacks and historical information. So the next one is actually this how the report is going to look like once you activate your Azure DDoS standard, and pretty much you can see the different sort of metrics and historical informations, and also you can act upon and you can just route the traffic and you can push all these informations to your centralized log management system for further processing and further auditing or further action to act upon. So the next one is actually the Azure Front Door, and pretty much this covers two parts here. And this front door is actually a global entry point for your, in case if you have a workloads that spread across your different regionals in order to meet your disaster recovery requirement or regional level disaster recovery requirement, and that's where this front door comes in. And front door is actually a layer 7 kind of load balancer, which means that it just purely takes care of your HTTP based workloads. Right, and also this comes as a, this comes as a WAF as an optional component. If in case if you are hosting your applications that are not being protected, or your or your backend that you do not have, so in that case, we can just go ahead and enable a WAF capabilities to to ensure that your application is well protected from all sort of vulnerabilities, right? And also you can you have all sort of capabilities what we said, and like you can just offload the SSLs, and you can just encrypt and decrypt, and also it's going to be you can have and also moreover this front door itself, it sits at the edge locations, right? So that comes by default as your DDoS protections as well, because it sets at the perimeter level. Okay, so and that comes to DDoS and the perimeter layer of securities. And the next section is actually to talk about the networks. I think I will pass on from here. I'll pass on to my colleague Shamila, and who is going to, take over. I was going to talk about the network and identities and physical security of physical security offerings of Azure.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Murthy. Thanks a lot, Murthy. Let's start with the next layer of defense, which is network. Let's talk about network protection for a while. Securing a network involves complex combination of resources, especially when a user coming from intranet or internet to access the services hosted within your Azure infrastructure. Their connection actually goes through multiple layers of protection to prevent any authorized access or attack to happen. Controls to filter network traffic over these layers, whether it's ingress or egress, are supported by multiple services like Azure Firewall Service or private endpoints, whereas ASGs or NSGs. Let's try to understand each of this component a bit more in the next slide. Coming to the Azure Firewall. For any organization, perimeter network is the most vulnerable area, and that's exposed to numerous threats. Here comes Azure Firewall, which is a cloud-native service that does east to west, north to south traffic inspection, covering level 3 to level 7 packet filtering and threat intelligence, and can alert or deny the traffic coming from the malicious IP addresses or the domains which are updated in real time to protect against any sort of new or emerging attacks. Moving on to the service endpoints. VNet private addresses can overlap, and you can't use overlapping IP addresses to uniquely identify the traffic. They come service endpoints in handy, which provides the ability to access the resources from your virtual network by extending the VNet identity to the service without reserving any public IP or overhead to maintain NAS servers, etc. But taking the optimized route, which is the Microsoft backbone network. How feasible it is, right? So moving on to the network, next layer of network protection using the private endpoints. While some of the organizations are stringent about securing all their infrastructure assets with private IPs alone, there comes private endpoints, which uses the private IP addresses from your virtual network to securely connect to a service through the private link. Services like Azure Functions or App Service become inaccessible publicly when they're associated with the private endpoint, but whereas remaining services still require additional controls to help prevent access to that Azure service associated with the private link resource. Moving on to the next layer of network controls, which is NSGs and ASGs. Both NSG and ASG are used to determine or administrate and control the network traffic. But the only difference is Network Security Group is the Azure resource that will use to enforce and control the network traffic using ACL, whereas Application Security Group is an object reference within a network security group used for micro-segmentation of dynamic workloads. Let me give you an example. In a 3-tier architecture, web layer should only have access to the app layer, but not the DB layer. Hence, in that case, we can infer that we just enforce a deny rule over a DB NSG from the web NSG. Moving on, the last section of the network control, which is securing the remote connectivity. Often when it comes to securing the remote connectivity, it is beneficial to use VPNs or express route gateways so that your traffic travels within the channel, limiting the man-in-middle attacks or packet sniffing. And the public IPs attached to these gateways can defend the DDoS or brute force attacks by design because there's a DDoS protection which is enabled by the Azure itself. Moving on to the compute protection. When it comes to infrastructure as a service security, building compliant compute solution is must. Let's understand a bit more on how we can protect them against the common threats, which is anti-malware and the VM security. Coming to the first section, which is anti-malware protection, which it is a free real-time protection that helps identify and remove viruses, spyware, and other malicious software to keep your digital estate up to date with latest platform and signature updates. By default, anti-malware is installed on all the guest operating systems, whereas for virtual machines, it's left as an optional feature for the organization to install with default or the custom configuration. Moving on to the next section, which is VM security. As we talked about protecting our compute workloads against anti-malware, it's also important to perform OS updates, OS patches or updates regularly to meet your compliance requirements, especially when hosting CI workloads. We do understand that any data that you're bringing to Azure is important for us. Hence, by default, VM disks are encrypted at rest with platform managed keys. And if required, if you can even use any other keys like customer managed key or bring your own keys from your on-premises or from any other cloud providers to encrypt the data inside the VMs. Next comes protecting the VM against the network accessibility, which is nothing but by actually locking down the sensitive host by just allowing the access when needed. This is actually done by Defender for Cloud by enabling the just-in-time access, which actually configure the ports at a specific time and restore back to its original state. Along with this, Defender for Cloud provides the time-to-time recommendations on the security vulnerabilities if in case they were overlooked. Moving on to the next section, which is identity. The modern security perimeter network now extends beyond the organizational network security and also including the user and device identity. With the growing trend of identity theft and attacks, it is important for enterprises to spend some extra effort to keep their identities safe. In Azure, we have Azure Active Directory, an intelligent, secure, cloud-based solution which leverages advanced machine learning-based threat detection and perform automatic remediation to protect your identities against threats. Moving on to the next slide, which is identity protection. Let's try to understand what does the identity protection mean and what types of risks that identity detection does cover, right? So, which is, as I have mentioned in the screenshot, you can see there are different types of risks that you can see, which is leaked credentials, sign in from anonymous IP or locations, or sign in from infected devices, etc. These are the different types of risks that identity protection covers in Azure AD. In Azure AD, actually, it will help trigger a remediation for these type of signals by enforcing MFA, conditional access, and many more. Let's try to understand each of the security features that does identity protection in Azure AD. Coming to the first protection in identity, which is SSO. SSO helps to solve enterprise fragmentation by using single set of credentials for improved security and compliance. There are several ways you can configure an application for SSO, and the method actually depends on how your application is configured for auth. If you're using a cloud-based application, you can use OpenID or OAuth or SAML-based authentication. Whereas if it's an on-premise, you can still use password-based or integrated Windows authentication when your applications are configured for application proxy. This particular flowchart will help you to decide which SSO method is best for your solution. Moving to the next layer of identity protection by Azure AD is MFA. Multi-factor authentication, or MFA, is a process in which users are prompted for an additional form of authentication such as a code on their cell phone or approving the request on Microsoft Authenticator app during the authentication process. If you only use a password to authenticate a user, and if the password is weak or has been exposed elsewhere, an attacker could be, it is easy for attacker to gain access. But with MFA, security is getting increased because this additional factor isn't something that's easy for an attacker to obtain or duplicate. Next comes RBAC. So when it comes to RBAC or role-based access control, it's important to follow the least privilege access model to eliminate the risk of exposing wide area for the attackers. Always sign less privileged roles, as a best, or highly privileged roles only during the specific intervals when needed. Example, just in time. And enforce 2FA as a mandatory step to help protect the identity from being compromised. Next is conditional access. Conditional access is a way to express policies to determine what happens after an authentication. It empowers users to be protective wherever and whenever and protect the organization's assets at the same time. It isn't intended to be an organization's first line of defense for scenarios like DDoS attacks or something, but it can use that signals from these events to determine the access. For instance, if a user logged in outside a corporate network from unmanaged device, right? There's a signal that's been triggered as a session risk, which is median and above. And whatever the controls that you have established, let's say trigger an MFA or block the access, will be enforced by the conditional access as a threat to that particular identity to perform the malicious activity that the user intended to do. Next comes privileged access management. Privileged identity management provides the time-based and approval-based role activation to mitigate the risk of excessive, unnecessary, or misused access permission to important resources. These resources include Azure Active Directory identities or any Microsoft online services like M365 or Intune. It enables you to perform specific set of actions, example, time-bound access to a resources using the start and end days, or providing the just-in-time privileged access to the resources, or enforcing MFA to activate any rule, or performing access reviews. Please note that this enabling privileged identity management does require a P2 license or E5 license for you to work. Moving on to the next slide, which is just-in-time access. Just-in-time access is also a feature of PIM, which enables you to request elevated access for the Azure resources during the troubleshooting or maintenance. That means to say that you only have or always have read-only access to these resources, but a specific period of time, you actually elevate your role to get a greater access to perform some actions. Moving on to the next slide, which is access review. Access review is again part of the PIM. And what actually access review means, right? Let's understand a bit more or a history of it. Excessive rights can actually lead to compromises, especially with larger enterprises when people join and leave the company or move different teams. So proactively engaging IT team for granting the access would be very cumbersome. So Azure Active Directory access review will help organization to efficiently manage these group membership and access to the enterprise application and role assignments. User access can be reviewed on a regular basis to make sure that only the right people have the continued access. Next comes physical security. All our global data centers and the infrastructure are secured with multi-layered protection and compliant with industry or country-specific standards, example ISO, HIPAA, or Singapore MTCS, etc., and continuously monitored 24/7 with global security experts, which will help address your GDPR requirements, especially when you're hosting your critical infrastructure in Azure. Moving on, as we have learned numerous layers of security in Azure now, let's understand how do we operationalize this in an organization and segregate the responsibilities of the SecOps team. First step is to gather the logs into a centralized data store to perform some real-time analytics, example using the log analytics workspaces, which is further integrated to Azure Monitor for visibility and performing some actionable insights. Okay, then what are we going to do with it, right? Next, going to the next slide. Modern security operations, moving on to the next slide, yeah. Modern security operations help extend human skills and expertise across multi-cloud and hybrid environments to meet the threats posed by the attackers. Azure Defender for Cloud comes in handy, which integrates with on-prem and multi-cloud resources through Azure Arc, performing the anomaly detection, behavior analytics, along with the threat intelligence to perform or to identify common attacks on these resources with actionable recommendations. Moving on, because these serious cyber attacks often happen in the near real time with human attack operators, success metrics for these security teams should focus heavily on time attackers have in the environment, on helping defenders reduce the time by using the XDR tools, like example like Microsoft Defender or Microsoft Defender for Cloud, which gives the deeper visibility into specific asset types and provide enhanced detection, response, and recovery capabilities, along with high quality alerts that have a false positive rates by complementing this with any CM tools. For example, in Azure, we do have a native CM tool that's like Sentinel. Yes. Moving on. Lastly, I would like to conclude the session with the cyber security reference architecture, which showcase Microsoft's cybersecurity capabilities and how they integrate with the existing security architectures and capabilities. Many of these products in the architecture have integrated intelligence and analytics from the security graph directly into threat detection and security guidance. I think now we are already at the end of the session, and I would like to open the floor for any of the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharmila. Thank you, Murthy. Yes, let's go through the questions. We have a bunch of questions by the public. Please continue to post your questions and we will answer them. The first question was around where can we find the CCOP documentation? Was answered. You can have it on the Cybersecurity Agency website. You can download the latest edition there on the website. Another question on the recording. Yes, recording will be available in 2 to 3 weeks, as on demand as well as on the YouTube channels, right? So that will be available, and that will include. We will also include the deck in the thank you email you will receive after the session. More on the technical side now. When we have multiple subscription in maintenance, do we need to purchase DDoS for each DDoS protection for each subscription? And what is the difference between basics and standard?
Yeah, I think pretty much, as I mentioned, right? So Azure, any resource what you host in Azure, right? By default, it comes with DDoS protection. Okay, so that's we call it as the DDoS protection basics. So your environment is well protected, so no doubt about it. Okay, but if the customer really wanted to have a visibility of what is being protected, okay, how much attack was there yesterday? Okay, was there any attack attackers who targeted my resources, right? So this kind of information, if really what customer wants to keep it or the customer wants to generate, right? There are use cases where customer would require this kind of a report access to the the DDoS attacks to their own resources, right? So because they have to document it, for a compliance reasons, and for a yearly auditing and etc. Right? So these are the reasons where what DDoS Advanced standard provides. And on top of that, your DDoS, telemetry informations can be directly integrated with your Azure Monitor, right? With the help of with a DDoS standards cube. So by doing that, pretty much you can since Azure Monitor comes with all set of a remedial action, you can automate it and you can do alerting mechanisms. So you can push your data into your central log management, SCM tools. There's all these kind of possibilities. It opens up for all these kind of new possibilities. Yeah. So that's a core difference between the DDoS standard and the DDoS, the basic version.
I think the another questions would be whether the single DDoS protection is enough to have in single tenant, right? So actually, the single DDoS protection can be enough. So you don't need to, because it's a covered 100 subscriptions inside one of the DDoS protection plan, even if you have a multiple web app.
There was a question on how to enroll a device. can we provide some documentation on how to enroll device?
How to enroll device into DDoS? Was that a question?
That's a bit confusion. Is it related to DDoS or Active Directory?
Yeah, because there are two aspects to it. Because when it comes to DDoS, yes, DDoS protects at the network layer. So if you have a DDoS standard, then pretty much you will have an option in the individual network properties. You can just go and look at where you can go and enable DDoS for that virtual networks. I don't think we have an option to enroll individual device to the DDoS because that is not meant for that way. Because DDoS itself is meant to protect your network layers. Right, so that one. So if the question is related to Azure Active Directory, then yes, we can enroll device into Azure Active Directory, and where you can onboard your client device directly into our AD, so that and your device can be seen as part of your Azure Active Directory to manage your devices.
Maybe a bit related to Active Directory also. What is privileged identity?
Shamila, you wanted to take that?
So the question is, what does a privileged identity management mean?
Yes.
Okay, so privileged identity management is a time-based, approval-based activation to mitigate the risk of excessive access permission that was already granted, right? It enables you to, allow a specific set of actions, let's say time-bound access or just-in-time, or enforcing MFA, or conducting access reviews.
Yeah, maybe now maybe just want to add because PIM brings in approval capability for any sort of role-based access or user accessing any of your Azure resources. Yeah. So because if you don't have PIN, pretty much what happens is you just go to the individual resources and grant an access, then user can directly log into the resources, right? And user can directly gain access to the resources. But if you are putting PIM in the middle, so PIM brings in additional approval capabilities, and also it is where you can go ahead and pre-schedule the approvals. Okay, this so-and-so users can only access the system such as so-and-so Azure resources from this time frame to this time frame. So it just brings in the control. User access and their control identity control management.
And there was a question specifically when we should use managed entities.
Managed identities.
Yeah.
Yes, there are use cases, and of course we do have two kind of managed identities. Right? One is a system managed identity, another one is a user managed identity, right? So managed identity is actually when you wanted to have a service to service communication without any human interactions, right? So for example, if you have a system A and want to talk to a system B, right? Or maybe if you want your application servers connecting to your SQL servers or connecting to your backend servers or integrating with the other third-party applications which are hosted in Azure or which in those cases, what you can do is it's typically it's kind of if you are coming from your classic on-premise world, we use a term called service accounts, right? So in a modern world, the service account that is that is the one which get replaced into your managed identity. So managed identity in the sense there is no any password to it. So and without using any password, we are allowing system to system or resource to resource communication. And the password cycling and and everything is handled by by the product itself. So and of course as I mentioned, there is a user managed identity as well, where you don't want the Azure as a platform do not want to manage this kind of identities. Instead, you wanted to create your own identity and you wanted to control and you wanted to use it. For example, you have three systems and three systems talking to a database. For all these three systems, you wanted to use a single ID, single managed identity. So these are the scenarios where and typically user would go ahead and create a user managed identity, then so that they can use the same identity for multiple places. In multiple places, yeah.
I already posted that comments in chat as well.
I think we have covered most of the questions. Don't hesitate to ask more questions. Thanks a lot for your participation, everyone. We will ask you to fill a survey. That really helps us to improve our sessions based on your feedback. So by all means, please provide your feedback with what you liked, what you would like to see as well in the next sessions. More hands-on, more presentation, different type of speakers. Don't hesitate to share any kind of feedback. It's very valuable for all of us. With that, thanks a lot for today's session. Looking forward to see you for the next round. Next week, we'll focus on the, I think there is unleashing the modern SecOps, right? So that's the next session, focusing on how we embed security for developers and securing all your supply chain for your software solutions. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.